I am Asha Dore, and this is Totally Biased Reviews for Parley Lit.
I'm Jen Oakes, and happy to see you here.
I'm really happy to be here and talk to you about your awesome book.
I love this book so much, in part because it terrifies me. I think it's a scary book in some ways. There's just a lot going on in it that is, I feel like I'm a newly peeled human being in it in some ways, in terms of the things it exposes. And, right, on the other side of that is I feel like a newly peeled human being in it. Not that that's a weakness, but it introduces me to my own weakness in terms of how I show up in the world or want to, because I'm fairly private. And so it kind of puts things out there that I think I would tend to hold inside. The book is thinking a lot about memory. It's thinking a lot about personal memory, private memories, family held memory, environmental memory. Like, what does the air remember? What do trees remember? How are we woven out of and into memory? I loved thinking about that. It covers a really long time span. Some of the poems are 10 years old, and some of the poems were written just a few months before the book was accepted for publication. And so for me, that feels pretty lumpy. And just in terms of, it's like this time travel. When I think about how everything fits together, I have to lean into my gut on that one. I feel like it does. Mm-hmm. Could I articulate exactly how a certain poem fits in? No, for some of them. Absolutely for others. I think a lot about the way that it's bound together by memory, by image. I love the images in it. A lyrical poet. And so I think the strengths are in, again, trusting those lyrical leaps, like just that intuitive leap of logic. I had some poems in there before this was accepted that felt a little bit mean to me, where I was working through something and whatever it was. And then I think a lot about Stanley Kunitz, who said every poem is a love poem, and then Stephen Dobbins wrote about how poetry is a place for kind of like a form of love. It doesn't have to be loving or positive, but there is something there with love, and that fiction is a place to exercise different demons. And I know, I think a lot about that. Think about whether it's true. But then in my own work, I know that I'm always eventually dissatisfied with poems that come out of a place that is small. And so those poems got taken out, and I was happy about that. So that's a strength and a weakness too. Like, they existed. But they probably existed as a way to open a door into something else.
One thing that I wrote down is just that the environment seems to know a lot more than the people in the poems, at least up through the second part. Like, the trees know things, I think it's the world knows things, the air, all these parts of the environment. And I really like that. Like, I underlined a bunch, and I read it twice. Like, I read the book in pieces, and then I went through and read it as if it were a novel. And so when I read it the second time, I was like, maybe I'm just putting all this meaning into it because I'm reading it as a sequence. But I thought that was really an interesting thing, because of course it's true that our environment has been here longer than us, so it knows a lot more than we do.
Yeah, I went to New Orleans a long time ago, and there are these signs that say, please do not shoot your guns into the air at midnight, and this is for New Year's. And then I just thought, why are people shooting the air? Why do they do this? It just seemed rude. To just shoot a gun into the air. I mean, yes, the bullets come down, and that is rude too. Like, that's another rudeness. Tragedy, violence, right?
Yeah.
But just to shoot stuff, and people shoot a lot of stuff. And then I heard that statistic about the Gatling gun, and there's that long poem in there about the Gatling gun where the goal is to see how many rounds can happen per second. And I was just thinking about when time gets carved up, right, by violence, and when like these memories we have that are already fragile, super fragile, and then you start punching holes in them, and it's like, what have we got anymore? And then with that gun, like, they're measuring time in bullet rounds, which to me seems insane. And it's like such a sadness for something to do with the beauty of time, where we hold memory, right? And we hold events, and we hold space, and all those things through time. And suddenly it's like you're going to measure it with bullet rounds. That's a different kind of memory. To put them into the air like that fast, that changes the way it smells. It's even the resonance in the ground of having the vibration of things falling onto the ground, and that the violence of that in the air. I was thinking though about how communities rally together. I was thinking about the shooting that happened in Orlando and Sandy Hook and these places that people have heard of, but then suddenly there's a huge rallying, a worldwide rallying around these places, or people go to war and suddenly the world rallies, or doesn't. And I was just thinking about the logic of how as soon as people start shooting other people, suddenly everyone's like, oh, I love that person and I love that place. And so thinking too about this, the grand irony of being introduced to love by having it be, the object of that love be erased through violence, and suddenly people are like, oh, love, which seems so messed up. And so I think that was the initial logic of the poem, was like learning how to love in reverse. It was a cool poem because it allowed me to go back through time and think about all the things that I've loved, that are kind of gone now, and that I love more because they're gone in some ways. Because I was probably a total ingrate, for a lot of them, or young, and thought that there would be a million more moments.
We just don't get it until it's gone.
Right.
For some reason, it's such a weird part of our consciousness. It makes me wonder if animals are like that at all, or if they just know somehow that it's going to end.
Yeah, I feel like we know nothing about non-human animal consciousness. It always makes the news when it's like, horses have a sense of time. Hunger is a sense of time, right? Eating sleep is a sense of time.
I really liked the poem about aphasia in the beginning. And, I'm not making the assumption that these are autobiographical, but they read as autobiographical.
A lot of them are. I mean, right, there are always those multiple kinds of truth. So a lot of things are that point of departure of being embedded in that initial truth of just like, this thing happened, and then there's a point of departure into this other truth where you jimmy the facts or details or add more or take away and carve until you get to the kind of truth that was the point of entry to. So
yeah, I love that about poetry. I think it's like such a nice form because you can just like move around in reality. The complication of multiple lives.
Yeah, that is a poem. My dad had a glioblastoma a number of years ago. He passed away 5 years ago. That was amazing. Like, one, there's intimacy, such intimacy in knowing that someone you love is going to die and having the time to reconcile things or just say things that are important. There was also, as he got closer to death, he probably wanted to say more, but he was able to say less because of the brain region with language. This isn't in the poem, but when he got really close to dying, I called and my mom answered the phone. I said, hey, I'd love to talk to Dad. Just hold the phone up to his ear. And she said, well, I can't talk back. And I was like, I know, but just hold the phone up. And so she held the phone up to his ear, and I was chatting with him and I said, I love you, Dad. I love you. And he'd gotten so good in his lifetime at saying, I love you back, that even though he really couldn't form sentences at that point, he was still cognitively very aware, but he was able to say, I love you. And those were like the last words he said. And for me, it really spoke to the huge importance of really training your neural pathways to be good, to say things that matter, right? To be in that moment of the real.
Yeah.
Because those neural pathways can override a lot of other things that are going on in your brain.
It's so true. It's such an interesting thing.
And his mouth still knew how to go there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's so amazing. I've worked with people with different cognitive impairments and TBIs and stuff early on in my career, and I saw a lot of evidence of stuff like that. It's really interesting to me.
It is really interesting.
Yeah.
It's a great lesson. I mean, it's a great lesson.
Yeah.
Just in terms of making sure that you're accountable to being better, so that you're not stuck with some lousy neural pathway at the end of your life.
I like that a lot. Maybe I'll take that into therapy.
The complication of multiple lives. 5 states away, my father says, the sun is making chicken. His cancer opens a shadow hand in his brain. What the hand touches, the world slides sideways. He watches his window like a television that plays reruns of the 1940s, the tree, the road, the still air. Back where I live, we're trying to figure out how to order pizza the way we used to before a teacher explained sex to our daughter. It's like pizza, she said. Everyone likes it, but with different toppings. And you have to talk about what you want before you order. And now we just go hungry from laughing too hard to make the call. So what if language doesn't quite work anymore, or works so much that it means anything? When I visit my father, he tells me he misses the hair of branches on the blazing bar. I admit I too miss the leaves and those trees we planted together, and it's all right if he can't reply, if the words just fall out. He sleeps. I return home. I am blue, so I tell my daughter it's like a falling barn. I mean life, but it sounds like I'm talking about pizza or sex. Then I say, whoa, check out that flowering field, and it sounds like that's about sex too, which makes us laugh, which makes me cry. We name every item in the entire world, and it's like we're giving birth to sex every time we point to something. The bone is bleached by the sun. The hawk is circling its prey. It's always hottest in August. All of the sentences mean and do not mean. The whole time, my father is trying to make one real sentence. He says, death. He says, death. He says, death is different from winter. He's dying. We drive past all the places we might go someday. My father scratches at the window and dies. We go on living. I love everything disastrously. Whoever you are, the trees have always been on fire.
So what's one of your favorite poems?
This is one of my favorites. I love the poem. I love this poem. It gets nowhere close to understanding the weirdness of somebody dying. It gets nowhere close to understanding anything better, but it does give a framework to like the multiple lives. Like you have to exist in different domains at the same time, and you have a parent who needs you and a child who needs you, and you need yourself and all those things. The very last poem I love too, the one about the beauties, and I was thinking there about, I went down to Playa, in like southern Oregon. There's this huge lake bed, and when I got there it was completely dried. It was all cracked, and so it had these giant like the cracked dirt in these big shapes that all fit together, and I could see this distant dust, and I was like, I'll walk into the dust. And so I just started to walk across this lake bed, but I never got there. And then I was like, I think I'm in the dust. Like, I think I can see it, but I'm also in it at the same time. And then I got back, and somebody told me about who had a reality show. I think that he'd had a traumatic brain injury, and that was kind of prominently featured on the show, but kind of as entertainment, which just struck me as so bizarre. Yeah, I love that poem too. Again, memory. Thinking about that. And then my long poems. I really like the long poems.
Yeah, I really like the long poems too. And I wanted to ask you what you think about this. Why a poem and not a story or an essay?
The really long poem, What the Bullet Teaches Us of Love. It had a couple of different titles. That one I don't feel like could have been anything but a poem because it's image driven. The lyricism in it, I think, drives it. And then it jumps around between pieces. And so there's just a lot of weaving. And so it's like fragments being woven, and I would say that one is big on the intuitive lean. You're really trusting just that there's something else around that corner, and it goes there, and then eventually it comes back to what came before, and then it goes back into that other corner, and so there was a dance of all that braided stuff. And then the other poem that was kind of long, in my original Kansas When We Were Iron. I mean, I did write a novel, but I don't really think in terms of story or novel. I think in terms of image. And like you said, poetry allows you to slide around a lot. I mean, there's just a lot of trust that things cohere, sometimes to like very little, difficult to get to feeling or intellectual question, or a way of packaging an idea that asks a new question that the poem doesn't quite answer, but it reveals that question is there and it's important. And so I think poetry does that really well. That long poem was thinking about depression. It was thinking about cell memory, our evolution of memory and of place, and of like, where are we present? How do we show up in our own mind or for ourselves? There's that Bow Down by Karen Green, and then Nance Van Winkle's Sister Zero, and they're both memoirs in a way, but they're like these little vignettes. They're like these tiny little shards of noticings, or of, again, just remembrances. And they're so gutting. I mean, they're just harrowing in these ways, but they're asking questions again and again, not in the question form, but like these are different ways of getting at just trying to make sense of, like, how do we make sense of? And so by faceting that idea, by asking it in a variety of ways, through the form of these vignettes or through the form of poems or shifting, you start to reveal what the question is. Like, what is it that I'm even grappling with that has necessitated the utterance of these things? Like, what is the question? If we're not so sick of COVID, I'll read you my COVID poem.
Oh, that sounds great.
Okay. This is probably one of the newer ones that's in here, in addition to the one about my dad. This is the opening poem. The film. The future rubs itself on the world and leaves a film. You look outside. Trees are where birds separate themselves from the sky. Everyone needs a break from the distances we've placed between us. Your mother calls you so you can explain the plot of a book she doesn't understand because the movie made no sense. Other people are wiping their faces on the salesgirls to prove that their breath carries freedom. Each tree seems to accept the world as it is. A person you could love is feeling his lungs to see if there's enough air left for promises. Can I read an old poem? This is the poem that I worry about my mom reading. Gods of the Counterfeit Sky. We'd meet at the door of his shared house and head to his rented room with a blanket for a bed. I was so new to sex, I assumed everyone spent a few years doing it on the floor in gas station bathrooms as a way to pay their dues. For months, he'd emptied his change on the floor, so by the time I got there, it was the cheapest constellation in the world, making us gods of a counterfeit sky. We lay vastly down upon it. We ruled over minor Ursa Minor, over even smaller Dipper, Orion the Forager. My sticky skin gathered coins like a jukebox, and then sounds came out. My back took pennies and dimes, quarters rained from my thighs. Urgent constellations aligned, and I hung over the entire world, answering prayers. I rolled through that time like a god, gathering the terrible loneliness of finally calling it quits on creation so it can start going wrong on its own. Even now, I find the fallen change glittering up from gutters and parking lots in nearly every city.
Is there anything else you want to say about your book or anything?
I do want to say that 42 Miles Press is an awesome press, and in the writing of poems, and I'm just very grateful to the editor there, so David Dudley, and the editors everywhere of these little presses that are bringing voices out into the world. And so I think it's a hero's journey, and I remember my first book of poems that got published, and I thought, oh, now the world's really going to change for me. And I woke up in the morning and was like, oh, sparkly new day with a new book of poems, like everything's going to change. And then you find out that not many people read books of poems and nothing changes, and you are you, and like it is sparkly because the book is awesome, but your life doesn't change. But what changes is that you now know about these bigger networks of people who are reading carefully, and they're doing amazing things, and they don't do it with a big readership, and they're not doing it with a big budget. So I guess I have a lot of gratitude knowing that things weren't going to change right with the second book, third book, and so this is book number 4. I really wanted a relationship with the editor. It was like, if I'm not going to get a huge readership, and there's no money in poetry, right? But so what's left? It's community around it, and that's what I wanted. And I just feel like he's like just done a great job with that. And so to the extent that we can just thank our editors who are doing heroic work and other people who are sharing voices into a broader community, I just think that it's remarkable. Super grateful for that. I think that there's such decency in kind of being a bridge between an author and the world. I love that. I mean, it's such a stewardship of ideas.